Good evening, everyone. Buenas noches. My name is Liz Fernandez. This is the penultimate webinar in preparation for the NYSAIS Job Fair to Promote Diversity, which is scheduled to take place on Saturday, March 4th from 10 to 1:30 at Columbia Grammar and Preparatory School. This evening's panel will feature colleagues from independent schools who are speaking to the intersection of being LGBTQ plus and being a person of color or self-identifying in these two ways. And so we wanted to host this opportunity because each of us has some visible and invisible identities that we carry with us wherever we go, whether it's in our workplaces, community spaces, houses of worship, to and from on our commutes, in places that are familiar and that are unfamiliar. And there has been an incredible opportunity through this job fair to talk about being a person of color in independent schools or in predominantly white institutions. There is rarely the opportunity to really focus on the intersections of parts of our identity that are visible and invisible. So we wanted to host this evening to provide an opportunity to ask some questions, to listen to the individual experiences of our three panelists. They are speaking through their own voice and through their own experience. I have some questions. We had some folks send us some questions in advance as well. And so I will fold those in. If you are viewing this live, terrific. We're glad you're here. If you are viewing this recording after the fact and have any additional questions or anything you want to follow up on or any wonderings, please don't hesitate to reach out. I can be reached at jobfair@nysais.org. That's jobfair@nysais.org. And with that, creating a space to have this conversation about our intersectional identities, I want to invite Kenneth, Crystal, and Alejandro to introduce themselves. Let us know where you work, what roles, how long, what type of school is your place of employment. If you've worked at other schools, you can speak to where you were previously and the kind of schools that they were, so people understand there's lots of different kinds of schools. And also, if you're an independent school alum, an independent school parent, various roles that you might have. I will pause in a moment. As I said, I organized the job fair, and I have for quite a few years. I use she, hers, ella pronouns, and I am really excited to have this conversation with you all. So in order of Kenneth, Crystal, Alejandro, please introduce yourselves and welcome. Thanks again for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for having us. Good evening. My name is Kenneth Hamilton. I am the assistant head of the lower school at Poly Prep Country Day School. And our lower school is in Park Slope in Brooklyn. And before that, I worked at Dalton, where I was a third grade classroom teacher and the lower school equity chair. And prior to that, I worked at Trevor Day School. And so my experiences have all been in progressive oriented spaces. And I'm happy to be here. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I'll pass it off to Crystal.
Thank you, Kenneth. My name is Crystal Alof. My pronouns are she, her. I am a multiracial and queer educator at Brooklyn Heights Montessori School, which is a Montessori school located on the unceded homelands of the Lenape people, known as Brooklyn, New York. I am currently an upper elementary teacher, so I teach a combination of 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. It's my 3rd year at BHMS and 9th year teaching. The previous 6 years, I taught at a progressive school in Los Angeles called Westland School. And I'll pass it to Alejandro.
Thanks, Crystal, and thanks for the land acknowledgement. My name is Alejandro de Sans. You can also call me A. The main pronouns I use are they and Z, and I currently work at the St. Anne's School, which is an urban set, mid-size, co-educational, non-secretarial pre-K through 12 independent school located in the Brooklyn Heights neighborhood of Brooklyn. I'm also an alum of the class of 2014, so it's nice to be back in a new space, in a familiar space in a new role. and I currently serve as the college office coordinator and a recreational arts teacher, where I teach 2 high school units of yoga. And I also support DIB work by serving as a community meeting and affinity space facilitator in the middle school, and a faculty advisor to the Black Affinity Space / Black Student Union in the high school. And I will pass it back to Liz. Thanks for having us.
So y'all are really, really busy. And I just want to let everyone who's viewing, it is completely coincidence that we have 3 of Brooklyn's finest educators on this panel this evening. It was not intentional. And I am so grateful that we do, that we have the 3 of you who have joined us. I'm sure that there are many, many, many educators who would identify in these ways and would be eager to speak to the ways in which their lived experiences in these schools intersect in a variety of ways. This is who was available this evening, and we are grateful. So Brooklyn in the house, and we want to hear a little bit more about how did you end up in the independent school world? If you could tell us a little bit about your professional journey, knowing it's only 60 minutes or less, but, sharing a little bit about how you ended up where you are as an educator within these institutions. It would be probably helpful for people to hear, I loved hearing Alejandro's an alum. So, the experience of being a student. Perhaps there were other alums, or maybe it was, for a different reason. Anyway, Alejandro, we'll start with you, and then Kenneth, and then Crystal. How did you end up in these independent schools?
Sure, thanks, Liz. So I'm an alum of the class of 2014, and I ended up at St. Anne's by way of Prep for Prep, which is one of the country's programs that help students of color attain matriculation at independent or boarding schools in the Northeast. And when I was in the process of looking at the schools that they had partnerships with, I was really, really attracted to St. Anne's wide and diverse course offerings. So they have over 200 high school courses offered annually to about 375 students. And the really student-centric approach to grading, aka there was none. So rather than a letter or a numerical grade, students receive full-length reports, narrative reports written by each one of their teachers twice a year. So with those things in mind, it seemed at the time to be a really student-centric place that would allow me to pursue the interest that I wanted. And as a student, I got to see that was likewise true on the faculty side. Teachers are given a lot of autonomy in terms of how and what they teach. So when I was looking into getting back into the educational space after working in a nonprofit for a little bit, I thought about some of the support systems I had as a student, be it the deans or just some of the other adults that showed up with a lot of genuine care, which you'll also find in the St. Anne's community. And though there were gaps, sufficient enough that I felt inspired to come back and try to, be the adult that I also needed when I was there, and try to serve the next generation of students in that way. So that sort of is what brought me back to St. Anne's, is having that personal connection, that personal experience that Liz was talking about, and just wanting to help students in the same way that I was helped.
Awesome. Thank you for that. For me, I had no connections to the independent school world. I come from a family of educators, and we were public school through and through. And I was going through the certification process and had one more test that I needed to complete after grad school. And I needed to work in between. So excuse me, I started exploring independent schools because the credentialing process was different. And similar to what you just mentioned, Alejandro, there was a creativity that existed there that didn't exist in some of the other spaces I navigated, right? There was autonomy, and teachers got to bring in their expertise and their interests. And that really sparked my interest in understanding what the independent school world was about, right? And how each community has its bespoke culture and their own culture. And that got me excited in thinking about how I can grow as a teacher in these spaces. The other piece to this that was interesting for me was recognizing how many independent schools in the city were doing work around diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Now, that's not to suggest it doesn't exist in the public school world, but I didn't see it exist in this way. And so that's also what fueled my career. That's part of what led to my transition from Trevor to Dalton, where I did the equity work and got to dig into creating some of those developmentally appropriate lessons for our kids to think about the next generation. How are we creating and holding space for kids to show up every day? That's what got me excited about being in independent schools. And I've stuck around for a little while. So I think I'll be here for a little while longer. And I'll pass it to you, Crystal.
Thank you, Kenneth. Yeah, I attended independent schools my whole life. So I understand, that feeling of, not fully being seen or trying to blend in and fit in. I had no idea I wanted to be a teacher. I actually ended up going to business school. And when I graduated, I opened up a business with my dad and quickly realized that life was not for me. So, I thought about teaching. I was always able to connect with children. So to dip my toes into the teaching world, I started substitute teaching at public schools in Los Angeles and some private schools, including my high school. And at the same time, I was house sitting and nannying for a family whose children went to a small independent progressive school in Los Angeles, like I said, Westland. Long story short, the family connected me with the school and I ended up staying there for 6 years until I moved to New York. And I'll pass it back to you, Liz.
It is fascinating that no matter what we think our life's plan is going to be, or even living in uncertainty, somehow we find our way within schools, and then we're, at least for me, excited about the different kinds of schools that there are, the different kinds of spaces and places where young people get to see themselves reflected in who is teaching them in the curriculum and the world around them, and are also given windows of opportunity to see others. And I'm so grateful that whatever the paths were that led you to where you are now, that you are in the spaces you are, because of course, like so many, I believe that all children, all young people, all young leaders really benefit from having people in spaces that are really intentionally thinking about, as you said, Kenneth, that next generation of leaders, and how are we supporting them to be leaders for good, leaders where accountability and thoughtfulness and kindness and empathy and compassion and affirming advocacy work is part of what our students take on in service to the missions of so many of the schools that speak to it. And so I'm curious if you could talk about the ways in which your intersectional identities, and you're not limited to race, ethnicity, gender identity, and or sexual orientation. You are not limited to those. You can sort of go in whatever direction you'd like. What I'd love to hear is, in what ways have your intersectional identities informed your educational philosophy, your leadership philosophy, your educational philosophy, your teaching philosophy? Just really curious how it's all sort of come together at the moment, knowing that we're all evolving and that we're all on a journey. And so we might reconsider things depending on whatever ends up coming up. But for wherever you are right now, would love to hear from Crystal, and then Kenneth, and then Alejandro.
Thanks, Liz. I would say, coming from an independent school background, I find representation to be really important. Whether it's representation by me just showing up as my full authentic self, representation in my class library. So making sure to have a selection of fiction and nonfiction books with, diverse perspectives, queer main characters, I think compared to the resources and books from when I was a kid, there are so many wonderful, stories, nonfiction texts that are out there that are so wonderful for students. Integrating queer stories and voices, like I said, throughout the year and not just a one-time event. As far as curriculum goes, I often am guided by the Learning for Justice framework, which is an online educational platform, has great resources. And that platform has these 4 domains that anchor your teaching. So it starts with identity, and then you move on to diversity, justice, and then ending in action. So I spend a lot of the beginning of the year really focusing on identity work, and in turn empathy work, exploring questions like, who am I? How does looking closely at ourselves help us understand others? Or how can we hold compassion for one another in our differing experiences? And I'll pass it to Alejandro? Kenneth.
I'll jump in. That's all right. We got it. We're team working it here. For me, I think to take it back a step, my educational philosophy is grounded in the understanding that students make sense of their world and educators act as guides along the way. How are we framing and posing questions for them to construct meaning? And so that approach, in order to have that approach, I also have to be receptive to the perspectives that are present in the room. And I can't do that unless I'm considering who's in the room. And so when I think about that, my experiences as somebody who presents as racially ambiguous, coupled with kind of my introverted nature and who I was as a math student, as a math learner, right? All inform my pedagogy, all inform the way that I'm approaching independent schools and the way that I approach education. And so what I mean by that is, recognizing in my own experiences being asked, what are you, right? No, what really are you, right? And needing to justify or defend my identity against what was being projected on me, and recognizing that there were times where I didn't have the vocabulary to say what I wanted or needed to say. That informs my practice. I think about my queer identity and how that's an identity that may or may not be visible to some folks. But in my lived experiences, there were moments rather, where sharing that identity put me in a position of harm, put me in danger. And so recognizing how that informs my practice. And then lastly, thinking about who I was as a math learner. I struggled with math. I mean, it's my jam now. I can do math all day, every day. But there was a moment where I really struggled and didn't have an understanding of who I was as a math learner. I thought I was bad as a math learner. And so when I think of all of those different sections of my identity, they all converge to push me to think about, how am I holding space for those kids who might be quiet, who might not be willing to share, or who have something that they're not ready to share? What does it look like for me to call in the kid who's in the back and not really raising their hand? What does it look like to get them excited about learning, and for them to realize that they have a place in our community where they can assert an identity and it will be affirmed in that learning space? And so thinking about how we're intentionally designing not just curriculum, but also the physical learning space. Who's in the community? Who has power? How are we sharing that power? That all kind of, my personal identity informs that practice.
Yes, thank you for all of that, Kenneth. I resonate with so much of what both of you have said so far. I think for me as a baby of the 90s, I was born and raised in the midst of what we often dub as the cultural wars, especially in the field of education, which more than anything was really just a contestation of definitions and like Kenneth said, oftentimes a contestation of power. So who is, or what does it mean to be American, or whatever nationality or whatever ethnic group? And what are the aims of an education in an increasingly diverse and globalized society? And who has the power to name and tame those opportunities present in our social constructs and contracts? And the answer that I was shown as a student, as I said, going through prep was rooted in academic exceptionalism, bought into the myth of meritocracy, and often privileged performance over self-knowledge, embodiment, and wholeness. So for me, a lot of my educational philosophy is really rooted in that student-centric and healing-centered approach, which might not be too surprising. And similar to Kenneth, really seeking to empower our youth to establish and pursue their own notions of success without fear of failure or punishment. And I also believe that educational experiences that fully embrace our physical, cognitive, and socio-emotional needs, we're breathing deeply, fully, and being able to self-regulate or tap into other tools, be that other peers or adults or resources in the school environment to help regulate yourself, are possible and becoming more and more commonplace in terms of what we're talking about when we think about equity work and bringing a healing center perspective into that as well. And when I think about my own experience, it was the fact that in spite of all of the challenges I faced with the multifacets of my identity in a predominantly white institution, that the compassionate adults that I had there were enough for me to make it through and still be inspired into this work. So I think for me, it's important to allow students that same opportunity to bring their full selves into school so that they can find, as Liz alluded to, those mirrors and windows that we've all been talking about, right? That reflect and refract those different facets of ourselves. And really being able to embrace our students at all times with whichever facet seems to be leading in a given moment. So, yeah. Thanks, Liz. I'll pass it back to you.
You know, there's the Me Too that we do, you know, particularly in so many lower schools, or the snap when someone says, you know, for me, it gives me, there's a dear friend of mine whose birthday happens to be today. Happy heavenly birthday. He used to call them tiriquitos. They were like little goosebumps or chills or something when you react when someone says something that really resonates for you. And over and over, it's the affirming moment of just knowing that young people have educators who are being this thoughtful, who are being this intentional, who are being clear about how they enter into spaces and co-create spaces for young people to bring all of who they are, in all the messiness and insecurities that come with every age that we work with. And that's, you know, that's a really beautiful and powerful part of the work that we do as educators, providing those spaces for the young people in our lives. I want to shift a little and talk about schools, and in particular, some of you have attended, some of you have worked in multiple schools. So, you know, it's a two-part question. How can schools communicate a respectful and welcoming environment? Think about that, you know, from the second that someone, you know, might apply, a prospective family going through an admission process, a candidate coming in for an interview, whatever that is, whatever, you know, framework you have. And then the connection to that question really is for a candidate. So advice for a candidate, what should they be looking for if they identify in these intersectional ways? What should they be looking for to assess a potential workplace that is going to be, first and foremost, physically and emotionally safe, and affirming and welcoming and respectful of all the different ways that people live and identify? So it's a two-part question. You can go in whatever direction you want, because really there is no one way to answer either question. So Alejandro, Kenneth, and Crystal, in that order.
Thanks for that question, Liz. So one of the things that attracted me to return to St. Anne's, since for me it was a return, was a belief in the institution's ability to change, despite it not yet being what I needed or where I wanted it to be during my time. And I think one of the benefits of these really intimate communities, even at St. Anne's with the size that it serves, is that I was able to matriculate, become an adult, and still maintain a number of close relationships with the mentors and supporters who I relied on and looked to for guidance during my time as a student. And being able to maintain those authentic relationships allowed me, as I continued to refine my perspective about education and what it was that I wanted to bring into the field, sort of keep a pulse and a meter on what was going on, not just at St. Anne's, but sort of the independent school landscape as a whole, because I think, as maybe you've intuited from, at least from like kind of being at various schools, there is the opportunity to sort of move through the independent school system and develop multiple relationships across the schools. So you get a sense of not just what's going on at the school you're ultimately working at, but through be it professional development opportunities, or if you're just an extroverted person and you like making those connections, finding ways to tap into the culture of the different schools and figuring out what's going on there. I think another thing that I personally resonate with is always having something written down. So for me at St. Anne's, that was them having an explicitly written out diversity statement on their website, and also a very big subheading for all of their diversity and equity work. Because to me, that means I can always point back to that as a reference point for, this is the kind of institution I believed would be serving students and adults in X, Y, and Z ways. And just having that sort of as a reference point and common language to be agreed upon before moving into any conversations about contracting. And if any problems do come up later down the line after onboarding, you want to be able to have some sort of language that you can point to that the school has made a commitment in some way or another to, as Liz said, affirming gender identities of students and adults, and just being cognizant and intentional about doing that work at every stage possible. And then I forgot who it was supposed to pass to, but I'm sure you know, and you will pop in.
Awesome. Hello. Thank you for that. You know, it's what jumps out for me is really about, like you said, having it written down. How is the organization, how is the school communicating where and what they value? How are they communicating who's represented in their community? What are the diversity statistics, right? And I don't mean to be reductivist and whittle it down to just numbers, but it is indicative of what the school is paying attention to and how the school is seeking its and approaching its diversity efforts. I think, to your point, the other thing is investigating what clubs are present at school, what affinity spaces are happening, what does curriculum look like, because that's letting you know what schools are having what kinds of conversations and how you can show up in that space. I think the other thing that's important for us to sit with is doing that research on the school and their community, because community in independent schools is such an inextricable part of the teaching and learning experience, particularly because these communities create those cultures, right? Like they're microcosms of what's happening outside. And so thinking about the clubs that they have offered, how you want to show up in that space, and also being sure that it aligns with your pedagogical approach. I think the last note that I want to make, though, is to unpack any ambiguity around traditional and progressive. And I know I've mentioned the word progressive in our conversations, but I don't want traditional or progressive to be indicative of anything beyond an approach to teaching. And I say that because there are many traditional schools or schools that have a traditional approach to teaching, where they are having these conversations and they are open and they are inclusive. So I don't want that to skew one way or the other, but the baseline of this is doing the research on the community, what's available, who's present, and how are they actively seeking diversity in their community.
It's kind of, yeah, I would add on to that. Of course, you can start out with your research on a potential workplace website. However, sometimes that's not enough to just, read the webpage and their mission statement, diversity statement. So I would urge to ask questions. Like, for example, I see on your website your school commits to DEI work. Can you share some examples of that commitment this past year? Or does your school offer affinity spaces for parents, faculty, and staff, and or students? What types of groups do you all offer? For me, a school that supports my personal identity journey is really important. my growth as a human and as an educator. So I would make sure to ask questions like, how do you support your BIPOC and queer employees? Do you prioritize BIPOC faculty and staff to attend like POCC, the People of Color Conference, and how often do you get to go? That was really important to me when I was trying to find a job in New York. So just don't forget, when you are interviewing with the school, it's not only about you being the right fit for the school, but it's also the school being interviewed to see if they're the right fit for you. And pass it to you, Liz.
Thank you all for that. I wanted to add a couple of other additional data points that provide evidence both in favor of the work that schools are doing in this particular space to truly be much more in alignment with mission, vision, and values. We know that they are aspirational, and there are some very concrete things that can be done that really make that aspirational effort more concrete. And you all have certainly provided wonderful examples at the micro and sort of at the macro level. You also, I want to highlight for everyone, you also spoke about doing some of the research, and that research can be done through the internet. I mean, truthfully, there is almost nothing that isn't accessible through the internet. And so really doing your research. There are definitely organizations that exist that provide people with additional insight. One of the things that I know for sure is that there are 203 independent schools in the state of New York, and somewhere around 180 of them are in the greater New York 5 boroughs, Long Island, Westchester County area. And so truthfully, in your circle, whether it's a college circle, a professional circle, house of worship, some service work that you do, you're in the artist field, your yoga class, whatever it is, chances are you're going to connect with someone who is linked to an independent school in some way, shape, or form. And so leveraging some of those relationships, so much of the work that we do around DEIB work is relational work. And so connecting with people and asking the kinds of questions that are important to you, and giving people the opportunity in the space to answer it again from their experience. Might be different for others, at least for you would get to hear from their experience what their lived moments have been like on a daily basis. I also want to encourage people. There's been so much conversation around language evolving, and gender inclusive language has absolutely evolved. And the ways in which we define gender now is very different than many of us were ever exposed to growing up, certainly moving away from a binary approach and really thinking and using language like all genders and all perspectives and all identities. And all of that is really key and critical. So during those interviews, whether it's at the job fair or in your process, listen for those cues. Binary language is very limiting and constraining for the young people that are in our care, and quite frankly, for the adults and family members that are also part of the community. And so listening to those key words and phrases that say everybody, as opposed to, the boys and girls that I teach, as it sounds so simple, and quite frankly, it is. And it could be effortless. It could be effortless if we were much more intentional. And so I really suggest to everyone, as you're thinking and assessing, take a look at the gender inclusive policy. So many of our schools are moving back to a travel experience, overnight experiences, to be very much a part of the learning and growth that our students and our young people, that's part of their learning process. What are the policies? Just asking those questions. What are the policies and expectations nearly every elementary school has some sort of family structure or family conversation. Take a look at what's on the walls as you're walking and taking a tour. You know, I loved, Crystal, you said, what's in your library? Take a look at what's in the library. I mean, in 2023, there are some extraordinary resources that are available to us at our fingertips as language continues to evolve. And we each have the capacity to do that individual work and to continue to grow. And also we have the capacity to wonder and ask and notice and listen and refine what we mean with language so that we are intentional in our inclusive approach. So I just wanted to offer that because it's something that really resonated, and I put it together from everything you all said with one another. In response to the question, can you talk a little bit about moments or opportunities that you have had in any school, either role or experience that you've had, where you've had the chance to express your identities and share your experiences within the school community? Again, is it an assembly? Is it a read aloud? Is it some of our schools have more formal moments like a chapel talk or something along those lines? I mean, it could be pretty much anywhere, a PD day, an assembly, etc. Just curious, can you speak a little bit to how you've used a space to express who you are and talk about your intersectional identities? Who was the audience? What was the prompt? What was the experience like? What was the buildup for you like? And then what was the after effects of it? Kenneth, and then Alejandro and Crystal.
I dig it. You know, this is reflecting on this question. I have 3 different experiences that come to mind. Typically in the start of the year, as a classroom teacher, I would start off with an identity unit. And so providing vocabulary for the students to self-identify, but also wanting to affirm that that's how they want to be seen. But I would participate in that activity with them. And so somehow that parlayed into a conversation around family structure. At the time, I had a partner, et cetera, et cetera. And I shared with the students that I was queer identifying. And I actually had a student at this progressive school that I worked at. He was kind of just awestruck, taken aback, like clutch the pearls moment. And he said to me in front of the rest of the class, he was like, I thought I liked you. Right. And so there was something there that he learned about what it meant to be queer that I had to unpack. And I share that because I think it's important that the kids are coming in with other experiences that we're unpacking. And so even though we have this community where we're creating safer, more intentional spaces, things can still go a little left. I had other experiences where I've shared my identity with my students via a read aloud. We were talking about Ally Week, which is now Solidarity Week, and doing some read alouds. And some of the kids were asking questions around the differences between terminology. What's the difference between gay and lesbian, and what does queer represent? And so being able to have that nuanced conversation with 4th graders and position my own identity in that I'm not gay and that I am only attracted to or in love with male identifying partners, but being able to explain and create an expansive understanding of what LGBTQ plus identities can look like. So I had the opportunities through read alouds and different events like assemblies. I will say though, that I'm a private person. And so sharing certain aspects of my identity does put me in a position where I feel vulnerable. And so it's important for me to name that before I lean into those conversations. But the other piece to this that I think is important is I knew I had the support of admin to have those conversations as a classroom teacher. I knew it was a community where those conversations were appropriate. And I knew it was a community where they were welcomed and encouraged. And I say that because sharing who you are is such a personal piece of our journey. And it's important that when you do that, when you're leaning into that vulnerability, you are in a community where you're going to be lifted up. And it's okay if that's not your community, if you choose to go that route, but I want to name that because it makes a really big difference, not just for the students' experience, but for the roles that we're playing as well in these spaces.
That was awesome, kind of, thanks. I'm trying to mull over my top three, but there have been an abundance of opportunities, honestly, more than I expected upon returning to St. Anne's. Some that I already anticipated were being able to connect with students in the process of their annual GUST, which is a conference that was incepted by students several years ago and has become an institutional staple. It stands for Get Uncomfortable, Start Talking. And those are student-led conversations on any number of topics that interest them at intersections of identity, power, and sort of the social contract as it's playing out at St. Anne's or in the world that they're seeing in real time. For me as an adult, there are adult affinity spaces that I did not expect there to be. For LGBTQ faculty and staff, for any number of racial or ethnic identity-based groups. And then a couple of my particular favorites have been being able to engage directly with the students. So in the upper middle school, really working with the affinity spaces and the community meeting structure that their head of school has implemented, where there are alternating meetings between a cohorted class of upper middle school students, learning about the different facets of social identity and how they intersect with power, both in our school and in our nation at large throughout history, and alternate with affinity spaces. So the affinity space I run on the off weeks of that is the trans and gender affirming space. And it's just actually super bewildering to me as a student who knew and named for myself that I was non-binary in the 6th and 7th grade. That there was now a space for students to be able to process and talk about those things and lean on each other for that. So it's also been an opportunity for me to sort of reconnect with that inner child as well and let them sort of soak in some of the joy and love that they're getting to see from students living it out today. And then last one would be Friday meetings. So in the high school, there's a weekly slotted time for either subject matter experts to be brought in and speak on a various range of subjects, usually relating to something industry or identity related, student affinity spaces, or grade-based dean meetings. So that's another time that we've intentionally built in as a school community to try to create greater commitments to that. And I will pass it over to Krista.
Thanks, Alejandro. Yeah, similarly to what Kenneth was saying, like I'm lucky enough to be at a school that will back me up and, my many identities. So as far as in the classroom, like I said, at the beginning of the year, I start off with identity work, and we unpack and understand, like, what are personal identities? What are social identities? Like, how do we identify? And, before students jump into that, I make sure to share my own identity web. Another example is we do daily morning messages. And I remember, I think it was National Coming Out Day. So we were talking about, what does it mean to come out? And we started talking about, like, privilege. And I shared, like, I have to come out every day as a queer person because the norm, or, the dominant culture expects people to be heterosexual. I guess another, basic example is my first year at BHMS. I ordered a progressive pride flag to have in my classroom, and unexpectedly got a box of 15 pride flags. So, like, I went around and ran around the school and made sure to give, like, pride flags to all my queer colleagues, and then my upper L team, and then my boss. I was like, here, put this up, just to symbolize that this space welcomes everyone. Everyone belongs here. And then as far as the school community as a whole, We have community meetings once or twice a month, and there's a Pride community meeting in June where we celebrate Pride Month. And actually last year, BHMS was in the Brooklyn Pride Parade, so that was very exciting. And I'll pass it back to you, Liz.
Thanks. One of the things that you all shared sort of as a common theme, and that's why I really try and frame these conversations on every webinar, is you're not speaking on behalf of anyone other than yourself and your own experience. And one of the things in particular that struck me was, Kenneth, when you were talking about progressive and traditional, and speaking to the fact that conversations can happen around a variety of topics in all sorts of spaces. And because there's so many different kinds of schools and so many different kinds of educators, there's an assumption, there's an inherent assumption that a progressive school will be a school where people who are part of the community, whether it's adults or young people, are going to be sort of much more attuned, you know, just sort of with it. Like I loved the way you said, you know, I'm here for it. Like math is my jam. Like you're going to be with it. An inclusive space is their jam. And yet you're absolutely right. We all bring in our own family histories, our own lived experiences, our educational experiences, all of the touch points that we've had that is an amalgamation that creates and informs who we are, how we live, how we move forward, et cetera. I bring that up because there was a question that was posed that was really about how one would, how you would advise when the right time is to disclose one's queer sexuality or gender identity within an institution that is perceived to be either conservative or anything along the lines. I know that and particularly in the last probably 5 to 10 years, conversations about progressive and conservative have instantly become polarized and certainly politicized. And so I say all this because it was a question that was posed by someone. I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on when is the right time? I think I know what you're all going to say, and yet I want to really honor the fact that someone has asked this question. So Crystal, Kenneth, and then Alejandro. And if what you were going to say, was said by someone else, like, it's totally okay to say, I'm good, I don't have anything to add, just in case.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I've been privileged enough to be at schools where, they back me up. So, I mean, if I were to be at a school where, it might feel unsafe, I guess where I would go is somebody I trust in that community, or maybe another colleague at a different school, maybe who's experienced something of that. I would ask for support in that way. Otherwise, I have no idea how I would navigate that. Yeah.
So this may be a little problematic, but I'm gonna commit to it. I'm gonna double down, right? It's this idea that I don't think anybody should come out. And so, like, I barely even came out to my own family. And what do I mean by that? I mean that I don't think it needs to be a sit down formal conversation. It's I exist, I show up, this is how I'm navigating the world. When I share what I share, you got what I shared. And so if I say, hey, I'm going out with so-and-so, you can now put that dot together on yourself. I don't need the label to create that. And I say that because when we're navigating these selves, I personally look for schools where I'm able to show up as close to my most authentic self as possible, right? And I say as close to because it's still work, and there's some shenanigans that Kenneth has to leave at home. But what I mean by that is going into work and getting to be able to speak freely about the people that I love and the people I connect to and what makes me proud to be who I am. So if you're grappling with when is an appropriate time to come out, I think I might be grappling with the idea of like, is this the appropriate space for me? That's where I would land on that. And I think the other piece to this that we can hold on to is when you feel it's right? When you feel it's salient, when you feel that it's important and it's going to be impactful and make a difference to what's happening in the context of your school community. I don't think that we need to be the sacrificial lamb, right? I don't think we need to be the diversity box for the diversity box, right? We don't need to just check that off and say, we got our queer folks, we're good with our quota, right? I think that we need to think about how we're navigating these spaces and what we want from these spaces. And then lastly, if you are navigating a space where you can't really feel like, where you don't feel like you have the space to share that aspect of your identity, that's okay too, if that works for you. I think that could also be a separation between the personal and the professional, and that works for some folks. So there's no quick and dry, but I would identify that as a space that I wouldn't be able to navigate.
I think that was so wonderfully said, Kenneth and Crystal. The only thing I would add to that is, again, I'm a written word kind of person. So again, if the school already has explicit written policies around their gender affirming practices for students and adults, a good reference point to have, if this is a situation where you sort of had an evolution of identity as you've been in the community, and it would be and you have a fear of there sort of being some received difference between your colleagues, I would say have a conversation with HR. I call HR for everything. I am their favorite friend. Just to get a meter on the sense of, again, what are the written policies, what has been the process before for previous employees that have gone through this. And echoing something that Crystal said at the very beginning is maybe finding another person in that same school community who is already out, who can sort of lend you their ear or lend you their experience to make the most informed decision that you can for yourself. And again, just echoing what Kenneth said, you are going to know what that best decision for yourself is at any given time. And for me, just to answer for me personally, I think if I had the trepidation and the questioning of if it was an environment where it could come out, that already enough is an answer for me. And for me personally, I like to bring it all. So that's just how I feel. And I'll pass it back to Liz.
So much good information, just super thoughtful. And when I said earlier, I have a feeling I know what you're all going to say. Yep. And that it's very much a personal decision, and so much is in the decision-making process before you even get to that point. Like, is this the kind of place that I want to be employed? And we recognize that there are so many different cost-benefit analyses that we have to do on a daily basis around providing for ourselves with basic needs. And, there are some community members who are not near schools that would likely be places that would be much more affirming, encouraging, respectful, inclusive. And so you do have to make certain decisions and really think about that. And my hope would be that no one has to make the kind of decision that could potentially compromise certainly their physical health, but also their mental health. It takes a great deal, and we all know this, whatever our various entry points are from. I loved, Crystal, when you brought up the identity web, an exercise that so many of us have done. So many of us leave parts of our identity at home, or on the doorstep. And one would hope that as we are trying to really promote mental health awareness and just wellness and self-care, that we are in the predicament and have the privilege, again, words that have been used, to be able to really reconsider if this is the right place. This is our last question, and there's about 5 minutes left. So think about that in as you're framing your responses. Is there anything you wish you knew before working at an independent school that would be helpful for a candidate who's drawn to this conversation, these identities, either for themselves or just thinking about what does it mean to be an expansive and inclusive educator? Is there anything you wished you would have known? Alejandro, Crystal, and Kenneth.
It's really big question. There's so many little like trades of the secrets of the trade that you find out once you're in the world. But I think one of the ones that would have been really helpful coming into the space is that with all of its benefits and challenges, independent schools, regardless of the institution's individual size, are really tight-knit communities. And by that, I mean that there are not many degrees of separation between its various stakeholders at the decision-making level and the ones at the execution level and the recipient level. So, which has, again, many benefits and drawbacks, but that is something to consider versus compared to larger school systems. Sorry, I'm gonna pass it to whoever was next in that rotation. Crystal, hey.
Hey. Thanks, Alejandro. Yeah, I would add on that, most of the time these independent schools have money and resources to support, if you're a teacher, your curriculum, your professional growth and your personal growth. So I always say, ask for what you need, because if you don't ask, the answer is always no. I'll pass it to Ken.
Awesome. Thank you. There's two things that I'm reflecting on. I think the first is recognizing, again, the difference between progressive and traditional and what those school cultures mean, but also recognizing, as you were pointing out, Liz, this idea that progressive doesn't mean right? Like we can be in a progressive community that thinks they're doing this work and actually they're doing more harm, right? Like, so having the understanding that every school is different, but also the differences between progressive and traditional. And I think the other piece is to build off of Alejandro is this idea of community and the close-knit, leverage the networks that are in independent schools, right? Not only are the communities pretty close-knit internally, but also the independent school network, right? So take advantage of those PD opportunities, get out there and connect with other folks and build that network. It gives you a thinking space, but it also gives you a sounding board to be able to process, collaborate, and connect and recharge, right? Like there's something restorative about community, and it's important that you have that community when you're navigating these spaces. Those are the things I wish I knew before.
Well, I want to thank the three of you sincerely for what has been just a fantastic conversation. I knew it would go by quickly, and one thing that I know for sure is that I want to continue the conversation. I'm grateful for the learning and for the affirming moments that I've had on this call, the ways in which we've all supported and really created community. Community really is at the core of so many of our schools and what they aspire to do. Young people and adults who feel safe and in their community, learn, feel better about who they are, and perform, at a much stronger and more affirming level. So, not a particularly articulate way to end, and yet I think everyone knows what I'm trying to say. And I'm grateful to the three of you. Again, Brooklyn, you came on strong. We are grateful, and I hope that if I can provide any answers to anyone who's viewing this, any additional follow-up, any wonderings, anything at any point, either before the job fair or during the interview process, or even during the offer deliberation process, everything that everyone said, we do have a network, and we are willing to support. And if I can't speak to an intersectional identity, I can tell you I know easily 10 to 15 people like that I can connect you with, because that's one of the ways that we really stay and support one another in spaces that aren't always conducive to our sense of connection. So that is so true. I want to thank my colleague Marcy behind the scenes for NYSAIS. Thank you so much. Those of you that joined live, we hope this was a meaningful learning opportunity. Those of you that will view this recording, please follow up jobfair@nysais.org. We will see you all at the job fair on Saturday, March 4th from 10 to 1:30 at Columbia Grammar and Preparatory School, or out and around, and feel free to reach out. Alejandro, Crystal, Kenneth, thank you for the gift of your wisdom and your time this evening. Forever grateful on behalf of NYSAIS. See you all very soon, I hope. Stay safe and healthy, everybody. Buenas noches.
Good night.
Appreciate y'all. Take care.